Welcome back to The Critique. This is the format where we slow things down to look at specific decisions in their original context.
And our goal isn't to praise or to condemn, it's really just to understand where strategy and reality met, and where they didn't.
Today we're analyzing submitted material on PepsiCo's strategic journey, focusing on that long-standing identity as the challenger brand, from its pricing strategies all the way to, well, modern cultural minefields.
And the material on its core identity is so rich, we should probably just dive right in there.
Agreed. Pepsi's positioning was, brilliant for a long time. They were the youthful alternative, the Pepsi generation.
Exactly. A total contrast to Coca-Cola's whole nostalgia and tradition thing.
And it led to huge wins. I mean, the 12-ounce bottle for a nickel during the Depression.
And of course, the pressure campaign that led to the new Coke disaster, a classic challenger move.
But that constant challenger stance, that's the thing. I wonder if we've really looked at the long-term cost of being, well, perpetually reactive.
I think that's our first big area to focus on.
The ongoing commitment to defining the brand through youth and timeliness creates a vulnerability, forcing constant adaptation that can weaken long-term clarity.
Right. And the weakness there is structural, isn't it?
Completely. If you rely so heavily on being the challenger, your entire identity becomes dependent on your main competitor.
On Coca-Cola.
Exactly. So your focus is always on short-term relevance, on being timely, instead of building something lasting and independent of the cola wars.
Okay, but hold on. Isn't that reactive nature the very thing that drove all that success? I mean, the challenger role requires an enemy to define yourself against.
That's a fair question.
You could argue that dependency delivered those huge wins, like with New Coke. So why call it a weakness?
Because those wins often lacked an intrinsic identity. The success was always relative to Coke's failure, not born from some deep internal meaning.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
If your entire purpose is just to be the anti-Coke, you end up spending a ton of resources just chasing trends to stay youthful.
Which leads to brand fatigue, constant pivots in messaging.
Right. It's hard to build real equity when you're defined by what you're not. If Coca-Cola vanished tomorrow, what would Pepsi really stand for?
That frames the vulnerability perfectly. The cost of just constantly adapting. So if that dependency is the weakness, where should the analysis go to find that core strength?
Well, the material should probably shift its focus. It needs to look at the strategic moves that established PepsiCo's identity outside of soda.
Right. Look for the models of intrinsic strength that go beyond that rivalry. We have to define the company by its whole structure, not just one drink.
And there's a perfect internal example ready to be analyzed.
For a concrete example, the discussion has to be reframed around the 1965 merger with Frito-Lay. The documents call it a marriage made in heaven, which is fine, but the analysis needs to hammer home why that structural decision is the actual strategic anchor.
Because it diversified the entire business. It gave them a resilience that no amount of cola marketing ever could on its own.
Exactly. And you look at growth markets now, like India, and snacks are driving, something like 80% of the revenue there?
That's the real story. That move away from the beverage conflict is what gives PepsiCo its lasting power, no matter what happens in the cola wars. That's the intrinsic identity that needs more focus.
Yeah, that really elevates it from a branding story to a narrative about corporate foresight and diversification. That merger let PepsiCo become more than just the challenger.
So moving from that long-term strategy to execution, let's talk about messaging. Specifically, the risk that comes with chasing timeliness.
Okay.
A big part of the submission is on the 2017 Live for Now ad with Kendall Jenner. The notes point out the immediate intense backlash.
I remember that. Net sentiment went from positive 2% to, negative 12%?
Instantly, it was a drastic swing, a huge signal of failure.
It really shows how fast you can lose control when you try to tap into something deep in the culture.
It does. And if the whole brand relies on being timely, that ad is the ultimate case study of timing gone horribly wrong.
The catastrophic reception of the 2017 commercial is a critical case study in the failure of performative relevance when messaging outpaces genuine context.
And the weakness was really a fundamental misreading of that cultural moment, wasn't it?
A profound one. It trivialized very serious, very specific social movements, like Black Lives Matter.
By using these vague aesthetics, the smiling protesters, the peace signs.
And centering it on a privileged celebrity who had no real connection to the issue. It reduced legitimate protests to just a lifestyle choice you could buy.
It's about credibility at the end of the day. The audience just knew the brand didn't have the organizational right to even be in that conversation.
Exactly. When a company tries to talk about politics, people instinctively look at their track record, at their structural commitment.
And here they saw a massive disconnect. The action was sell soda, but the topic was systemic injustice.
The brand was trying to symbolize culture instead of reflecting it. And without any real internal commitment, it just felt exploitative, empty.
So how can we push the analysis beyond just saying the ad was insensitive? What's the next step?
Well, any future examination has to go beyond the surface aesthetics. It has to analyze success or failure based on the company's internal commitment and, its history of structural change.
Did the company do the internal work to earn the credibility to speak out?
That's the question. And that's a great pivot. It moves the focus from the look of the ad to the required action of the company.
So for a concrete example, you could contrast that 2017 failure with, say, Walter Mack's targeted marketing to African Americans back in the 1940s.
That's a fantastic contrast.
Because that initiative worked precisely because it was built on structural decisions. Mack didn't just make an ad.
No, he hired an all-black sales team. He created advertising that showed Black Americans in a positive, dignified light.
He featured people like Nobel Peace Prize winner Ralph Bunche. That campaign was grounded in tangible, structural corporate action.
Which made it credible. It had the ethos that the 2017 ad completely lacked.
That comparison makes the point so sharply. Success isn't about the casting. It's about the decades of structural work behind the message.
Which brings us to the third big opportunity here. Pepsi's, let's say, variable relationship with risk.
Right. The material highlights two very different high-stakes moments. That unbelievable Soviet barter deal and the Pepsi Stuff Harrier jet commercial.
And these two anecdotes, which feel kind of isolated in the current analysis, are actually deeply connected. It's a paradox of risk.
One was brilliant adaptation. The other was an avoidable mess.
And that contrast is where we need to tighten the focus.
Pepsi demonstrated an astonishing capacity for navigating extreme geopolitical risk, yet failed to protect itself against the interpretive risks inherent in its own domestic promotional humor.
And the weakness in the analysis is that it treats the Soviet deal and the Harrier jet lawsuit as just two quirky stories. It obscures the huge contrast in how they managed risk.
I mean, the Soviet deal was radical. They had to trade syrup for Stolichnaya vodka because the ruble wasn't convertible.
Which eventually led to them acquiring a fleet of decommissioned Soviet naval vessels in 1989. It's insane.
It showed total brilliance in adapting to these massive external constraints.
So you're saying the company that literally acquired a navy as collateral got legally tripped up by a joke?
Yes! That operational disconnect is baffling. They mastered Kremlin negotiations but stumbled over a footnote in U.S. advertising law.
Right. They sailed through the chaos of Cold War trade, but then the Harrier jet ad, which was just supposed to be puffery, zany humor.
It results in a federal lawsuit because they fail to make it explicitly clear that it wasn't a binding offer to a reasonable person.
So they mastered geopolitical complexity, but fumbled basic contract law interpretation.
The paradox is that their flexibility on the world stage maybe made them a little overconfident about clarity at home.
That's the tension the analysis has to explore. These aren't two separate anecdotes. They're a study in contrast. Success in a foreign market doesn't excuse you from the need for absolute clarity in your domestic ads.
How do we illustrate that contrast concretely?
You detail the court's reasoning in Leonard versus PepsiCo. It hinged entirely on the fact that the commercial wasn't a definitive offer.
Right. The court pointed to the obvious tongue-in-cheek attitude.
Exactly. The absurdity of it all. Flying a multi-million-dollar jet to school without a helmet.
So you contrast that technical but totally avoidable legal failure with the success of the Soviet deal.
Which was this irregular but brilliant strategy to overcome a massive structural limit, a non-convertible currency. They solved an international trade problem with ingenuity, but created a domestic legal headache with a sloppy joke.
That brings a really sharp, insightful focus. It shows that a company's genius for risk management in one area doesn't protect it everywhere else.
A really fascinating look at PepsiCo's strategic life. I think we've landed on 3 really solid opportunities to strengthen this material.
So, to quickly recap the actionable suggestions, first, diversify the brand identity analysis beyond a challenger role. Recognize the Frito-Lay merger as the real source of long-term strength.
Second, ground the analysis of cultural messaging, like the 2017 ad, in the company's structural action and credibility. Use the 1940s mock strategy as the high-water mark for doing it right.
And third, use the Soviet deal and the Harrier jet lawsuit as a direct contrast to analyze that paradox of risk management. Show how brilliance in one domain doesn't translate to another.
As we wrap up this critique, we also want to acknowledge that artificial intelligence was used as a research and synthesis partner to help surface these patterns across a lot of information. It provides the factual basis for these analyses.
We genuinely believe these suggestions will push the material to a much more insightful place, elevating it from simple history to a really profound strategic analysis. We invite you to implement these changes and submit your work back in for another critique.
We'll see you next time on The Critique.